Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for coming, and despite of the hiccups that we had with the airlines, that I'm not gonna apologize on behalf of the airlines. But thank you, Yolanda, for all the effort and time to get here and share with us all your thoughts, experience, and many of the valuable insights towards the sustainability of this planet. I would like to thank the Center for Latin American Studies and the Doerr School of Sustainability for making this possible. Thank you, Alberto, as director of the center, for this, and to support the Tinker professorship program, which is part of this initiative, and share with Yolanda. With that, this is Yolanda, a friend of mine for many years. She's been a pioneer environmentalist in Ecuador and in Latin America, and proudly have to say that as an Ecuadorian, she has made it up to lead, to preside important organizations like WWF International, like the World Conservation Union, or IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and many. She's participant on many boards and forums, internationally speaking, and she now presides the Charles Darwin Foundation for the Galapagos Islands, which I had the honor to be executive director not long ago. So without any further delay, I present to you Yolanda Kakabadse.
Gracias. Thank you, Arturo. But really, I would love to see several of you come closer. I feel terribly distant. That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe Bill or Arturo told you that I have had a travel of more than 24 hours, something like 48, to come from Quito to Miami to San Francisco. Crazy. And I'm so happy that this is my destination and to be here with you all. Thank you for that invitation, Bill, and all of you. I prefer conversation than presentation. So I would love to see you raise a finger and say, can you say that again, or can you tell us something more about that, whatever, so that we can have a fertile dialogue between ourselves. I always prefer to tell you the story and then the lessons that I got out of that story. And I want to speak today about public policy. All of us talk about public policy all the time, the goods and the bads, and how do you make them, and what sort of experiences we have had. And I will tell you some. I was Minister of the Environment in the late last century, 1998. And one of the things I managed to do from the ministry was find a resource for protecting peoples in voluntary isolation in the Amazon basin. We have large communities. We had large communities in voluntary isolation in the Amazon, in the Yasuní National Park, and another one is called Cuyabeno. And I didn't know how to manage my relationship with the oil exploration companies. And of course, it wasn't within my responsibilities to negotiate with them. But I decided to go the hard way. A public policy that would protect those people and not much negotiation with the oil companies, and I'll tell you later on why. And so I invented a new term for protected areas, and that is zonas intangibles, untouchable zones. I decided that I could create it as a public policy, and so I drew in the map a corridor around the protected area, the two protected areas. And because that was a hard policy, the oil companies had to respect it. And so from one day to the other, when they were managing their operations or making exploration around the Yasuni National Park, they suddenly had a policy that was forbidding them from going into that area. And I tell you this story because that is one way of doing public policy. It's not always the best one, and it's not always the one that you should use. You take a public policy of that kind only when you have no other instruments, no other tools for negotiation. And of course, the oil companies were much stronger than the Ministry of the Environment, which was newly created and rather weak, even though most of the members of cabinet were very engaged with my agenda. I knew I couldn't in months or in less than a year do something that would restrict the companies from going into that area. So from one day to the other, Ecuador invents a new term and invents a new action and protects the population in voluntary isolation. I was glad I took it. It worked. The companies were not able to go there. But when you work on a public policy, the first rule of the game is engaging people and consulting people. I never consulted those people. The people in voluntary isolation, maybe they wanted to have a television set the next day, and cars and boats and I don't know, any of the luxuries we have. And I always will question my decision. Should I have taken a policy to protect people in voluntary isolation without asking them if they wanted to be protected? If the decision to remain isolated was a flexible one, or it was a tough demand on their part. And I still don't know. 22 years have passed, and I still don't know whether that policy, whether I did the right thing or not. That is one story. Those people now have had lots of pressures in these last 20 years, and they are not so isolated anymore. On the contrary, now everybody feels free to go into that area, and they feel free to come into the Western culture. And they eat tuna fish in a can instead of the protein sources that they had in the forest, because most of that has been affected in one way or another. And I'll tell you another story, which I love, that has to do with Galapagos and has to do with the policy. I don't know whether a policy, but definitely a response to a crisis. I was in my desk, also in the ministry, and I get a call from the director of the national park, Eliezer. And he says, "Minister, we are in a crisis." "What's wrong, Eliezer?" "A volcano is erupting." And I said, "So what?"
It's Galapagos.
Galapagos is always exploding in some way or another. And suddenly he's desperate and saying, "Do something." I said, "Why should I do something?" He said, "Because the lava flow is coming in the direction of a colony of a tortoise that is in danger. There are about 30 turtles in there, and they will be wiped off with the lava flow." Aha! That was different. So I said, "Eliezer, just hold on, I'll call you in an hour. And I called the Minister of Defense, a great man. And I said, Pepito, I need your help. It was more or less the same wording as Eliezer, the director of the park, was sharing with me. I said, I need your help. Yes, Yolanda, what can I do for you? I said, I need helicopters, soldiers, ropes, and nets. And in hours, I had the helicopters, the soldiers, the ropes, and the nets. And you could see this man hanging down from a rope, from the helicopter into the area where these tortoises were, with their nets on their shoulders, putting the tortoises. They needed 4 to 6 men to lift them up and put them in the net. And then the helicopter will lift the turtles and move them into a higher part where there was no risk of the lava coming. Now, in addition to being a beautiful story, why am I telling you this? Because of 2 reasons. One was engaging the army, the Air Force, in a conservation process. They had never in their lives dreamt that they would work for conservation. And of course, I had all the media come and talk to them. And they were so happy for having saved those tortoises. And they were so happy to be hateful beyond their territory, which was, like any others around the world, defense. But the other reason why I'm telling you this is because the same as the untouchable zones, I didn't consult the tortoises. And this was a man-made response. I didn't let nature work. Nature was, the flow would go over those tortoises and they would disappear, and that is life. That is what the planet is about. The energies that come and go, some are positive, some are not. But in my mind and heart, I was happy to have done that. But I knew that I was interfering with nature. And what is interesting about that is that it keeps you awake. 22 years have passed, and I still ask myself, what if the lava had come? And what if science around those tortoises were working in a different way? Not in providing them with the territory, but studying a species that had disappeared because nature worked. It wasn't a public policy, it was a decision of power. Probably if it had been a different minister, they would not have thought of the idea of, calling the Ministry of Defense and doing something about that. And the lesson out of that is whenever you have authority or power in your hands, use it. Use it to the best of your ability and to the best of meeting the demands of how can humanity live in harmony with nature. Nothing more. It's very broad debate. But that is what usually you are confronted with the moment you are a manager of a company, that you are the mayor of a municipality, that you are a minister of whatever, that you are a head of an NGO working in the social realm or in the nature-related topics. And definitely you build public policy from the top down when you can. And other times you cannot work from the top down. You have to consult the community. You have to give in to pressure. Galapagos again, earlier this year, the taxi drivers went on strike. There are very few cars owned by individual families. Most of the cars in the Galapagos are taxis. And the moment the taxi drivers get on strike, nothing moves. Tourism does not move because they take the people from the town into the airport. And many people missed their flights. And probably those people are now in their own homes in Finland or I don't know where, in Hungary or in the US, saying, I never go back to the Galapagos again because the taxi drivers prevented me from taking my flight and there was no authority to control that. And then you have to think, what if I was the authority? Galapagos is a beautiful example because it's unique. There are no other towns in the continent that are similar to Galapagos. And in the case of these islands, the population knows that power is in their hands. And they decide to strike, to raise the fees we have taxi boats that cross canal, and it was raising from 60 cents, I think, to $1. And they got it because the government was absolutely incapable of negotiating anything if we wanted to continue to have tourists in the islands. And that is the major income. It is the only income. Even the people who plant potatoes or carrots or tomatoes, they are produced for the tourism sector. And if you cut the transportation to and from the airport, you're cutting the bloodline of the Galapagos in every sense. Arturo.
Yolanda, thank you very much for sharing those two stories. I'm using of our friendship and taking advantage of how you are putting these experiences on the table for us to discuss. Can you share with us when you as a minister with power, of course, were retained on the island of Isabela?
That's my next example.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you for bringing that up, Arturo. But anyway, you see how much political pressure, especially if it is economic, it is very difficult to control and very difficult to stand by your principles. No principles at all. The taxi drivers wanted an increase, and they got it. And life goes on until probably a next strike. And then one of the most interesting parts of my life as a minister. Do you know the sea cucumber?
Mm-hmm.
It's the most horrible thing you can taste. It tastes like iodine, and it is iodine. And nobody in Ecuador eats sea cucumber. But we sell sea cucumber, which is a delicatessen for Southeast Asia. They love it. From Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and several islands further down, that is one of their favorite foods and a real delicatessen. And when you have a nursing ship that is waiting outside of the reserve, and you can convince the local fishermen to go and catch sea cucumbers that are caught by diving, one by one, to collect as many sea cucumbers as possible and take it to the nursing ship. Both sides get an economic benefit. The local fishermen, who never knew that anybody could eat those horrible things, but suddenly they are paid a lot of money to fish those and sell them to the mothership. And that is quite difficult to negotiate, especially when science is not there to tell you what to do. My first reaction when I knew I had to regulate that fishing was, what do I know about sea cucumbers? Nothing. Go to the Darwin station, nothing. Go to scientists of the oceans, nothing. Everybody knew why the crab had 6 legs, but nobody knew how to reproduce a sea cucumber. Because that answer would have given me the argument to say, this is how much you can fish today and leave for tomorrow. So I had to guess. Lots of these fishermen, and one of them, she's been elected the mayor of the municipality. Yeah. These fishermen were doing it in the dark and continued their business, and I had to go and regulate. So I had initial exchange of notes with the fishermen, and I finally decided to go to Isabela, one of the islands, where I would meet the senior leaders of the fishermen of Galapagos to agree on the number of sea cucumbers that could be fished. As I say, I guessed. They were fishing 200,000. I thought it should be 0. And so I agreed on 100,000. Just the middle. Did I have an argument, a scientific argument? No. Did I have any reason to discuss whether it could go up or down? No. But okay, we wrote the document and both of us signed. Yolanda is the minister and the fishermen, 3 or 4 of the board of the local fishermen industry. And so everybody happy. I get on the plane, and the plane was a 10-people plane, a very small thing. And I had a woman leader. She was a parliamentarian, a congresswoman, in the same airplane. She had gone there to push for higher prices and push for higher number. So we are there in the plane, and the pilot is sitting there. And the landing strip is there in front of us, clear. And he didn't turn on the airplane. Pilot, we are ready. The doors are closed. Yes. And suddenly I see a group of fishermen, of the ones of the sea cucumbers, walking towards the small airplane and standing in front of it. What did it mean? You can't go. Why they didn't want me to go? Because they wanted to renegotiate. 2 hours before that, they had agreed. Probably the congresswoman had told them that they were fools in not raising the number, and they decided to sequestrar. Kidnap me. I was traveling on the following day for a meeting of the board of IUCN, and I had to go. But I decided to play it in the same way. And I said, okay, I had lots to read. I got off the airplane, lied on the beach, and started reading 10 books that I had there, as if it was the most normal and natural thing. About 2 hours later, they decided, I told them that any renegotiation will not be there and will not be on that day. It would take place on a date that I will fix in a later, probably in a month or 2. Finally, they agreed, and they let the airplane go. But you can imagine all the noise. The fishermen have captured the Minister of the Environment, and she has been kidnapped and whatever. And the only way I could manage the situation was by pretending that I was not afraid. My knees were shaking, you can imagine. But I had to pretend that everything was absolutely normal, that I would not give in, and that my conditions would prevail, that I was the authority. And it worked. They decided to let me go, and we fixed another date. We didn't change the terms of the negotiation, but again, it was a moment where you could use the power, where I hoped to use the power, because I had no guarantee that my strategy would work. Probably they would have expected me to change the terms of the agreement there and then. And again, lessons from that? I don't know what are the lessons from that. Trying to have a dialogue that was high level, without insults, without aggressions, without calling them names or whatever, but keeping the same level of dialogue that one should keep if you want to negotiate anything. And that is absolutely important in the process of negotiation. Questions from you before I go on? Or comments, not necessarily questions, but comments that you might have.
Thank you. I had a question and a comment. So I teach literature here.
You?
I teach literature here.
Uh-huh.
So the moment you mentioned sonas infantiles,
Uh-huh.
I was moved by the metaphor and how this metaphor actually gained force of law. So that intervention, when you think about the use of language in the situation, is just something that I wanted to highlight and underline. And then my question for you has to do with consultation, because there's consultation and there's consultation. There's a pro forma consultation, when you bring people around the table and tell them to speak their minds, you listen, and yet you execute the vision you already had. So could you qualify consultation a little bit more for us?
I would say consultation is one of the most difficult exercises that we can have when I suppose in every field, but mainly when you are dealing with natural resources and environment, it's terribly difficult. It was one of the concepts that was built on in the Earth Summit in '92, that any extractive industry first had to consult with the local community that was going to be affected, which was very blurry. Whose community? How many? When is it going to be affected? How can people like the involuntary isolation express their minds? What if Ecuador is defending the ownership, the patent, unwritten patent of a plant that also exists in Rwanda? Who owns it? Ecuador or Rwanda? Because the extractive industry has to pay the rights of exploiting in their land. How do you fix a price? Ayahuasca. Who decides on the price? And what if this community says yes and this community which is next door says no? I have never found a way to believe that we have succeeded in a negotiation. It has always been parts, bits and pieces. But the legislation exists in every country around the world. Well, the US didn't sign the biodiversity convention. But most of the countries around the world, the US and Iraq, most of the countries have signed, but we don't know how to manage it. And how to believe that you are being fair on the negotiation and the costs and benefits for local communities. And so I don't know the answer. I only know that I'm in trouble whenever I have to negotiate the principles of ownership of the environment or biodiversity. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you. And I have to say that you're a wonderful storyteller, and I appreciate that much. I'm also in literature, so I had this question in mind because you have been telling us stories about how you learn lessons from governance and the exercise of power. But you also told us that when you were the head of the Ministry of Environment, it had been really created. And you mentioned not consulting with humans and non-humans after in the second story. And in the third story, you are bringing also the problem of negotiation and territory. And all of those are concepts that are part of the different definitions of environment. So I was wondering if after serving as Ministry of Environment, what was your idea of environment when you entered, and what is the lesson that you could have learned in terms of what the environment meant to you after serving as Minister of Environment?
Wonderful, beautiful question. I'll go back 2 decades before that. I was the director of an NGO called Natura, Fundación Natura. It was the first NGO of the environment in the continent. We had some sort of small and short appearances, but not really a process of building a society that defended the environment. Not being a biologist, not being a scientist, by the way, I studied educational psychology. So I changed from people to animals. But I was never a radical on biodiversity. I was a radical on environment. And that meant that I was always after the improvement of the quality of life of people within an environment that served both sides. Food, health, anything. So I was never in a position of, when I got into the ministry, of having to change the chip in my mind, but continuing with that work. And before the ministry was created, my NGO was the ministry. It was the entity that was permanently educating and bringing proposals of public policy to the decision makers. And I love public policy. I think that was the most fascinating part of my life as an NGO. And then within the ministry, I didn't have to adapt. What I had to adapt is in the NGO, I instructed. In the ministry, I consulted. I could not tell the people what to do. They would probably do it and try to catch me in a mistake or in a wrongdoing. And they would not work in favor of the agenda of the ministry. So the tactic of involving the people in the ministry in all levels, the technical ones and the secretary, all of them, had to be convinced that they were saving Ecuador, that they were the best entity within the government, and that I could not have had anyone better in producing a document. And that I learned. I think those lessons I will never forget, because the moment an individual in the ministry or a group in the ministry got recognition for having written a paper, for example, for my policymaking, I immediately highlighted the value of that team or that individual, so that all in the ministry would know that they were doing a fantastic work. My main lesson out of the ministry was, and continues to be, that unless you communicate, there is no chance of success. you have to inform your constituency in terms that anybody can understand. A friend of mine used to say, Yolanda, try it with your mother. If she understands, it's okay. If she doesn't understand, then we shouldn't go on with it. And that happened 20 years ago, but it continues to happen today. You are students in this wonderful university. I have 40 years of experience in environmental issues, and I don't know what is a ton of carbon. Gas emission. I have no idea. And I don't know whether I grab it, I can see it, it's transparent, it's solid, I kick it, I play with it. I don't know what is a ton of carbon. And everybody tells me that we are emitting carbon. What does it mean? And the reason, we were talking about that at lunch, the reason why we have such a small group in the planet defending biodiversity is because we cannot explain what biodiversity is in simple terms. And of course, the climate crisis agenda is for the technological world and for the financial world to deal with. But we should be working on biodiversity and how to defend that. And we cannot do it because nobody knows what we are talking about.
But when you say the concept of greenhouse gases gives an understandable notion, people know what a greenhouse is. They know what it means to trap heat. And so that, I think, has had much more projection than a ton of carbon.
I don't think so. I don't agree with you with the whole population that we need to engage. How many people of the community, not of Stanford, which is an educated community, go to a middle-sized town anywhere else in the US or in Ecuador, you say greenhouse gas emission. They look at you blank. Because the concept of a greenhouse, they don't know. They don't know that there is an emission of gases. No? So we reach educated people who have had the chance to manage those terms. And again, if my mother couldn't understand it, nobody could. And that is important.
I was wondering that you mentioned at the beginning how you discussed creating these, they weren't protected areas, but
Corridors.
corridors, yes, exactly. Sort of with the purpose of helping the voluntarily isolated groups there. And then you're also talking about biodiversity and climate change, and I was wondering if framing efforts to conserve parts of the Amazon in particular, if constituents respond more to that when it's framed as helping the people who live there versus framed as helping to reduce greenhouse gases, to protect biodiversity, to keep the trees from being deforested. Are there ways of framing it that you've found are more useful to people than other ways?
I tell you my favorite one. You were asking earlier, what is my agenda today? The Charles Darwin Foundation, WWF, and food loss and waste. Everybody eats. Doesn't matter which layer of education they belong to. And if you start educating the people about food loss and waste and the damage of putting food in the garbage, immediately they know what we are talking about. And immediately the people want to act, not just to understand the concept. They need to be active in something. And the moment you say you're buying too much, look at what happens on Sunday. You are throwing your tomatoes or your whatever in the waste. Landfills are full of food. They are not full of garbage. They are full of food. Do you know that if food loss and waste was a country, it would be the third emitter of gases.
Wow.
China, US, food loss and waste. That the people understand. The moment you take them to see a garbage sink and see the gases coming and the water polluting the rivers, and people that are hungry, immediately makes you connect to the ones who don't have, to the ones that have too much, and to what you need to do to reduce the gap between the two sectors. And that is fascinating because a child, men, women, rural people, local communities, and the president, they know what we are talking about. And that is a fantastic way of delivering a message, but it's basically a call to action. The other one is a message. The call to action is the one that incentivates individuals to do something about the problem. And we are working in Galapagos on food loss and waste. If you have been on a boat, I don't know whether you have ever seen the amount of food loss from the ship into the ocean, especially at night when all the passengers are sleeping. It's terrible. But some of the companies have a commitment to reduce that. And with easy things, not presenting a full dish of lobster or whatever, but small ones. When this one is empty, then you put another one. With that empty, you put another one. But if you put a big one, you cannot keep what is left on a dish. And so the people, the owners of these big companies of tourism, they are already doing something about that. And in Ecuador, we have started with the Galapagos, which is super. So,
can I ask you something about this? I mean, this is fascinating, and I've been learning from having Arturo here a lot about things I had not ever even asked myself, you know. So it's this kind of questions of how a closed system in a way works, because we live in systems that tend to never kind of conceive that you have to measure. I mean, this is something I've learned over the year with Arturo having been here. You know, you have to think of the gas that is going to be used by the taxi driver has to come out of somewhere, unless you have solar panels that will have whatever. So there's this energy thing in an island that you can understand is this closed system. But the challenge, I think, is that in many ways we never think as citizens in Palo Alto. We think the U.S. is where we do things, and we don't care if the energy comes from here or there, or the gas comes from here or there. I mean, how do you change that kind of mentality that in an island or in a ship, you know, you can see it, but in these bigger spaces, we never see those things.
Touching the emotional chord. If you leave it at an intellectual level, it doesn't go deep. It doesn't grow roots. And I'll give you two more themes or facts that work very well in convening people. One is security, and the other one is health. The moment you start talking about a polluted river, and the polluted rivers in my country that are responsible for 60% of babies' death, then you come with a different message. I had a wonderful colleague being the Minister of Health, and we created a program that was, we don't need more hospitals, we need less malaise, less sickness. That the people understand. The moment you link it to the family life, to to the health of the children, to availability of the resource. In terms of one, health, it works immediately. And the other one is security. I started working on a security agenda some years ago in the Amazon basin. And someone called me and said, Yolanda, you cannot use security just like that. Security is the Security Council of the UN. People will start mixing the two things. So I hope they question it. Because if you think that security is only against war, we are lost. Security is about food security, about water security, about energy security, and health security. And that means a lot when you start touching on the basics of what security means. I suppose here in California, water security is an issue. And then the people that is what we are talking about, climate crisis. And that is what we need to discuss. Agriculture and the patterns of agriculture affecting my security of having water or not. So I end with those messages. Never forget to touch on security and on health. There is, and on food loss and waste, of course. That those three avenues for reaching the communities are terribly rewarding, and it works. Thank you.
We thank you very much for coming. We thank you, Yolanda, for all the effort.
Any more questions from anybody?
Yes. We have a bit more time before I take Yolanda to the hotel for a bit of a refresh before our next activity.
Don't kill her while she's here. I mean, come on, let her rest a little bit.
Back there.
I have a question about how you got in it, like from the beginning, how you got from educational psychology into environmentalism.
By accident. I was very happy working in psychology with children with learning disabilities. I was in the late 20s, and we created with a group of friends an NGO. And I started volunteering for writing letters to WWF, to IUCN. We didn't know what they were. I didn't know what was pollution, what was the certification, what was D4. I had no idea. All I knew was that from childhood until that time, things were changing for the worse. And that's what led us to create this NGO. And volunteering took me into saying, the board, Yolanda, why don't you do it full time? I said, okay. And that was it. Totally accidental, in a normal day of the week. But I obviously had it in my blood. Because since then, and before, I think that taking care of environmental issues gets into your blood system, and it never leaves you. It's a virus that never goes away. You can hear people say, I was a lawyer, or I was a dentist. You never hear anybody say, I was an environmentalist. You stay an environmentalist until the end. Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. I'd be really curious to hear your perspective on improving the communication between science and policy. What do you think would be the main things that could be done right now?
That is the best question of today. I think universities are responsible for what has not been done and for the failings of a scientist to communicate. Now that we are in a university build, I recommend creating a career of interpretation of science. I had a couple of youngsters in my office in the ministry. I gave them a document of 200 pages and said, I want it in 1 page. What do I have to tell the president? And of course, the scientist is not responsible. The scientist is a scientist. But we need individuals who understand science and who can interpret it in policy, in public policy terms. Otherwise, I had to read that page between my office and the cabinet. And that was one page. I could not understand anything in a document of 60 pages or 100 pages or 200 pages. Impossible. So I insist that career is absolutely necessary. And I'm sure that every policymaker will bring in people that can interpret science into policy. It's missing. And it's an enormous gap.
We do have a major on scientific communication. I can't say how successful it is, but we do have that option now. And it's actually a track within the Earth Systems major.
Yeah. And a notation.
And a
right?
notation.
Yeah.
So people are aware of the problem, but I don't think we've figured out any answers at all.
We need to.
We do.
We need to. Every decision maker from the private sector or the or government, local or global, they need information that allows them to take good decisions based on science. Because the worst thing is decision makers who say, forget about the science, this is what I want. Now, science has to be in the core of the decision, that the decision maker has no capacity to interpret what a book says.
I'm going to take advantage of the timekeeping thing. Haven't you been a president of the biggest nature organization? One is WWF, but the other one is IUCN, which is based on science, or it was at least formally created with the scientific view of providing the government's data for policy making.
Yeah.
From your experience and knowing that it's a huge organization where there's many members, and I've participated in one that at least, when you vote for recommendations that are translated down into the different members, which many of those are governments.
Yeah.
What is the most difficult part of having scientifically based information that are translated into those recommendations? Then at the time of voting, give you an example. Sorry, I'm extending on this. At that time, I was in the IUCN World Congress in Hawaii, and there was one of these recommendations related to the stopping of the ivory trafficking, and it didn't pass. I mean, it was so obvious where it came from, the difficulty. But of course, behind that, there's a huge economic, trading of ivory and everything. So what, from your point of view, in order to translate those science into recommendations that could eventually go down to policy worldwide, or at least in regions that could, what are the difficulties, or what are the challenges, or maybe some avenues of success?
Dialogue.
Okay.
If the government representatives come to the Congress without having been briefed about the importance of a decision, they will just defend some personal interest or a government interest without discussing really the most important, the core of the decision.
But they must have lobbied, because it's a voting system,
Yeah.
and yet it didn't go through. I mean, if you find maybe 2-3 governments that are with the ivory market, but then you have the members which are representing the world, this is something that it just didn't click to me. And
Yeah.
I was just
What I love about IUCN is that in the country, you have a committee of members from government and the NGOs. And that has to be a permanent dialogue, so that when you come to the Congress, you have agreed on a unified vision. Very often it doesn't happen at home, so it just goes ill.
I have a quandary that maybe others share. when you care about biodiversity, sometimes you care about organisms and even places that seem so far from health, security, and food loss and waste. I care about a funny little Galapagos rail. It's a little bird the size of my fist. Runs around in the darkness in damp areas. And I care a lot about that. I can't get from there to security. I can't get from there to health. I can't get from there to food loss. It's just a funny little bird that almost no one else cares about. A pachai.
Link it to security.
How?
By relating what does that bird contribute to, and who benefits from that bird, which are other species in the chain of life. And you describe the mosquito, the bird, etc., etc. Probably the bird eats mosquitoes or insects of
They
some
do
sort.
eat insects. They
Yeah.
do.
So if we take away that bird, are we going to be flooded by the insects?
We've taken away the bird from 3 or 4 of its natural habitats, and we're not overwhelmed by any problem. It's weird because the more obscure the thing you care about, the harder it is to make those links. I really appreciate your message. And I feel very guilty that I don't always think first and foremost, how is my message going to reach my mother? She always asks me that, what can you tell me about what you're doing that's important? I say, oh boy, Mom, where do I start? Very good essay, a very good test. But darn it, I care about things that are really hard to build that argument for. And we know that because they disappear, and who cares? Well, I care, but, is it an esoteric caring? It's hard for me to get that emotional capital with other people. It's emotional for me. I really feel for their loss. We found one day on San Cristobal where they're not supposed to exist, and this guide and I were jumping up and down to see one bird. That's silly. But boy, was that emotional for us.
You probably can make a parallel with something that your counterpart cares about. I don't know, if you ask that person what would happen to your car if you cannot get a wheel to be replaced.
I think it's this idea that species extinctions are like popping rivets on spaceship Earth, that a couple don't matter, but a lot do matter.
I suppose at the end all matter or not.
Well, that's a good argument, and that gets you a little bit. But that's a small rivet. This little bird in Galapagos is a tiny rivet way out on some aileron in the back.
Well, I think part of it is, Yolanda seems to be presenting with the 3 things, what is an anthropocentric perspective? That's what we are. We're humans, and that's what we do. And you're talking about a biocentric perspective. And that's a little harder push because we think about ourselves and that's, and then everything else. But a biocentric perspective in the long run, if we really are serious about the Anthropocene and whatnot, is where we need to go. We need to really think about life in all of its complexity, and that's a hard thing to do because, there's poverty and there's this and there's that and there's that. And so, it seems that biologists and nature lovers and whatnot need to push it more. Ecology has been talking about it for a long time, but it's hard to break out of anthropocentrism.
I think her point, though, is we need to bring the 2 together. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me that there's a difference between the biocentric and the human-centric. We overemphasize that in academia. We are animals. So what's the big deal? We should care about the rest of life. We're all kin. We're all relatives. We're all related. But that's a hard sell.
Yeah.
It's hard to care about the pachai because you're related.
But I wanted to ask, is it possible that the turtle example you gave us, the lava, is just that people have in their imagination that maybe that turtle was a turtle Darwin saw? There might be a whole narrative where the turtle is so central and your bird
Sorry.
It's not.
Darwin saw them. He did. He wrote lots
Great
about it.
grandmother. Yeah.
Those are charismatic animals as opposed to a bird, for sure.
But we have to care about them all.
No, I'm with you.
So in thinking of discourses that have more or less traction, colleagues of yours, or I assume people that you may have been working with more or less closely in the past, like Alberto Acosta and Eduardo Rodriguez, have had lots of traction discussing things in terms of extractivism and the critique of extractivism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that tact.
Based on those two examples?
And I don't mean to be polemic. It's a real question, not rhetorical. Yeah.
It does have to do with ideology, but it's not the ideologies that we see today, or that are most popular today, socialism or capitalism. They seem to be apart, but when you talk about security and when you talk about health and you talk about the future, they are all on the same line. I have a case with the two names that you have presented. One is Budiñas, who they were and are. Alberto has changed a bit after the government of Correa. They were radical, and they suddenly, when with older age, they have been more open to listen and to discuss. They have become less radical, and that's interesting. I don't know whether it has to do with their personal experience or not. But we are all thinking about the same chain, the dependence of quality of life with the quality of the environment.
Right. It's very interesting how these things happen in waves, and so their work was translated into English a little later, than they actually intervened in Ecuador.
Yeah.
So there's this afterlife, and folks in the U.S. have a sense that Alberto Acosta's ideas are taking shape now, and that happened also 15 years ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions, comments?
I have one more. With the negotiation with people like the pepineros, the sea cucumber fishermen, sometimes they want a higher quota, and maybe scientifically it should be lower. And I was wondering how you would reconcile it with this idea that there's this illusion of inclusion. We talk to you, but then we do it our way. We talk to you and we do it our way. How do you avoid that when you're negotiating with someone who fundamentally you don't agree with? They want more money, and you want more species. You want more individuals. You want more biodiversity.
I have been working something like 20 years on conflict management, and intentionally I stress management because I don't think that conflict resolution is the formula. Sometimes you can resolve, most of the times you want to manage the conflict. As long as the people and the different actors are aware that the conflict exists, that's already management. When people are trying to make an effort to see how they can live together without killing each other. But I cannot talk for the US, but in Latin America, we are very good at creating conflict and very bad in managing conflict. We are a conflictive society. We love debate, and we love it's more than debate, it's attack and proving that you are right. And that is a culture that you need to change little by little. I have been training decision makers on conflict management, and it's fascinating to see once they understand that you don't have to be right, that you have to understand the others, immediately the level and the language of discussion changes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's been so wonderful to hear your perspectives. And I'm wondering, when you think about the future of environmental policy in Galapagos and in Ecuador, you know, the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years, what is it that you see in the best case scenario?
Depends on the day. When I'm optimistic, I'm normally optimistic, but I think that with age you recognize that this thing called the planet has always been changing, and that you cannot keep it as it was a year ago or a century ago or a millennium ago, and that we will continue to lose and recreate things. If you get depressed by the changes, you are lost. You have to see in the best light the changes and try to control some changes that are definitely and openly averse to equity, to quality of life, to whatever. But it's a fascinating exercise to try to see what can you win by that change. I'm traumatized at this moment by ChatGPT, and I'm trying to find what is going to be positive about that, and I don't know. I don't know yet, but I know that my initial fear, I have to let it go. I have to find something positive because I cannot stop it. It's going to happen anyway, with me or without me, and I better be part of a sector that looks for the benefits of that. Okay, my friends. Thank you so much. Lovely to be with you. Esto que tengo que dar, ¿no es cierto?
Sí.